In a grand Alabama estate, a 72-year-old widow was about to serve the most important meal of her life. What started as family dinners took a shocking turn when she discovered her late husband's relatives treating her like hired help in her own home. Martha Brown wasn't your typical grieving widow. For decades, she had been known for her sharp intelligence hidden beneath Southern grace. When she encountered systematic exploitation by those who should have protected her, she had no idea they were walking into her trap. What began as humiliation would become the most spectacular revenge her town had ever witnessed. Eviction notices served on silver platters. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The grandfather clock in the foyer chimed 10 times, its echo bouncing through the empty corridors of the Brown family estate, like a reminder of how hollow everything had become. Martha Brown stood in the doorway of what had once been Robert's study, her fingers gripping the doorframe as if it might anchor her to something solid in a world that felt increasingly unsteady. 6 months. It had been exactly 6 months since they'd lowered Robert into the red Alabama clay, and the house still felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for him to walk through the front door, calling her name the way he had for 45 years. "Martha, honey, where'd you put my reading glasses?" The silence that followed her memory was so complete it made her chest ache. She stepped into the study, her bare feet silent against the Persian rug Robert had bought during their 20th anniversary trip to Atlanta. Everything remained exactly as he'd left it. His coffee mug still sitting on the mahogany desk, a faint ring staining the wood where condensation had gathered during his final morning. His reading glasses lay folded beside yesterday's newspaper, dated February 15th, the day before his heart attack. Martha picked up the glasses, their familiar weight settling into her palm like a prayer. She could still see him, adjusting them on his nose, squinting at legal documents or financial statements, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Numbers don't lie, Martha," he used to say. "People do, circumstances do, but numbers? They tell you exactly what's what." The irony wasn't lost on her now. The numbers scattered across her kitchen table upstairs told a story she didn't want to read. Medical bills from Robert's final months. Property taxes that seemed to double every year. Utility bills for a house too large for one grieving woman. The harsh mathematics of survival without the steady income from Robert's consulting business. A knock at the front door jolted her from her reverie. Martha glanced at the window. A silver Mercedes gleamed in the circular driveway, so pristine it looked like it had never touched dirt. She knew that car. More importantly, she knew its owner. Victoria Brown Ashworth stood on the wide front porch like she belonged there, her blonde hair perfectly coiffed despite the Alabama humidity, her smile bright enough to power the house. She held a covered casserole dish in her manicured hands and wore the kind of black dress that cost more than most people's monthly rent, while somehow managing to look appropriately mournful. "Martha, darling." Victoria's voice carried that particular blend of sympathy and authority she'd perfected over the years. "I hope you don't mind me dropping by unannounced. I was in the neighborhood, and I couldn't stop thinking about how you're managing all alone in this big house." Martha forced a smile, the muscles in her face remembering the motion, even if her heart wasn't in it. "Victoria, of course, come in. You didn't need to bring anything." "Nonsense." Victoria swept past her into the foyer, her heels clicking against the marble floor with practiced confidence. "It's chicken and dumplings, Robert's favorite, if I remember correctly." She did remember correctly, which somehow made the gesture feel both thoughtful and calculating. Victoria had always possessed an uncanny ability to offer exactly what someone needed, while making them feel obligated for the kindness. They settled in the front parlor, Victoria perched on the edge of the antique settee, while Martha sank into Robert's favorite armchair. The furniture arrangement suddenly felt formal, like they were strangers negotiating a business deal, rather than family members sharing grief. "The house looks beautiful as always," Victoria said, her eyes sweeping across the room with an appraiser's attention to detail. "Though I imagine it feels overwhelming sometimes. All this space, all these memories." Martha nodded, not trusting her voice. The loneliness was overwhelming, but she hadn't realized it showed. "I've been thinking about you constantly," Victoria continued, leaning forward with practiced concern. especially about how isolated you must feel. Robert was always so social, wasn't he? Always bringing people together. He loved entertaining, Martha agreed quietly. This house was built for gatherings. Exactly. Victoria's face brightened as if Martha had stumbled onto the perfect solution. And that's actually why I wanted to talk to you. Marcus and I were discussing it just last night. How empty this beautiful home must feel, and how much Robert would have hated knowing you were rattling around here all alone. Martha felt a flutter of unease, though she couldn't pinpoint why. Victoria's concern seemed genuine enough. I have a proposition, Victoria said, reaching into her purse and withdrawing a manila folder. What if we could help each other? You need companionship, and, if I'm being honest, some additional income to help with expenses. And Marcus and I, well, we need a proper venue for entertaining our colleagues and friends. The folder lay between them like a bridge Martha wasn't sure she wanted to cross. What kind of arrangement are you thinking? Nothing formal, nothing complicated, Victoria assured her quickly. Just occasional use of your lovely home for dinner parties, fundraisers, that sort of thing. We'd handle all the arrangements, of course, and provide you with a generous rental fee for each event. Plus, you'd have company, conversation, the kind of social life Robert would have wanted for you. Martha stared at the folder. The practical part of her mind, the part that had balanced household budgets for 45 years, whispered that this could solve several problems at once. The loneliness, the money troubles, the overwhelming responsibility of maintaining such a large property. I'd want to review any agreement carefully, she said, her teacher's instincts asserting themselves. Of course, of course. Victoria waved a dismissive hand. Though honestly, it's just a simple rental agreement. Nothing you haven't seen before. Marcus drafted it himself. You know how thorough he is with legal matters. The mention of Marcus, with his judge's credentials and intimidating presence, somehow made the documents feel more official and less negotiable. Martha found herself nodding along as Victoria explained the terms in broad strokes. Modest rental fees, elegant gatherings, shared responsibilities. The first event would be just a small family dinner, Victoria explained as Martha signed her name to documents she was only half reading. Nothing elaborate. Maybe 8 or 10 people. A chance for you to ease into things. Looking back later, Martha would remember this moment with crystal clarity. The sound of her pen scratching across paper, the way afternoon sunlight slanted through the tall windows, the faint scent of Victoria's expensive perfume. She would remember feeling relieved that someone else was taking charge, making decisions, solving problems she felt too tired to handle alone. She wouldn't realize until much later that she'd just signed away far more than the occasional use of her dining room. Wonderful! Victoria clapped her hands together like a child receiving an expected gift. I'll start making arrangements immediately. You won't have to worry about a thing, Martha. Just leave everything to me. As Victoria gathered her things and headed for the door, Martha felt a strange mix of relief and disquiet. The house would have life in it again, voices and laughter echoing through rooms that had grown too accustomed to silence. She would have help with the mounting financial pressures that kept her awake at night. But as the Mercedes disappeared down the tree-lined drive, Martha couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had just shifted. Standing in her own foyer, surrounded by generations of family history, she felt like a guest in her own home for the first time in her life. The grandfather clock chimed the half-hour, and Martha realized she'd forgotten to ask about the specific terms of the rental fee, or who exactly would be attending these gatherings, or what shared responsibilities actually meant. She looked down at the copy of the agreement Victoria had left behind, the legal language swimming before her tired eyes. Tomorrow, she decided. Tomorrow she would read through everything carefully, maybe call Sam Washington for his legal opinion. Tonight, she just wanted to heat up Victoria's casserole and pretend that having someone else make decisions felt like relief rather than surrender. The house settled around her with its familiar creaks and sighs, but for the first time since Robert's death, Martha Brown went to sleep, wondering if she was still the mistress of her own domain, or if she'd just agreed to become something else entirely. The house settled around her with its familiar creaks and sighs, but for the first time since Robert's death, Martha Brown went to sleep wondering if she was still the mistress of her own domain, or if she'd just agreed to become something else entirely. 3 weeks later, Martha stood in her own kitchen at 5:30 in the morning, flour dusting her apron as she kneaded dough for what Victoria had described as, just a small gathering. The guest list had somehow grown from 8 to 23, and the menu had evolved from simple family fare to what resembled a 5-course restaurant meal. "Martha, darling, you're an absolute angel for handling the appetizers," Victoria's voice carried from the dining room, where she directed 2 hired servers in the proper placement of her rented china. "I know Robert would be so proud to see his home being used for such an important cause." The important cause, Martha had learned only yesterday, was a fundraiser for Marcus's judicial campaign. What had been presented as an intimate family dinner was actually a political event designed to impress potential donors. Martha had discovered this when she'd overheard Victoria on the phone, describing the evening as, an exclusive gathering at the historic Brown estate. Martha's hands worked the dough mechanically, her mind churning with the same restless energy. The rental fee Victoria had promised, $200, would barely cover the cost of groceries for tonight's meal, let alone the wear and tear on her good china, or the cleaning that would follow. But when she'd mentioned this to Victoria, her sister-in-law had waved away her concerns with practiced dismissal. "Oh, Martha, you can't put a price on family helping family. Besides, think of all the wonderful connections you'll make tonight. These are the kind of people Robert always said you should know." The irony burned. Robert had indeed known these people, and he'd spent considerable effort keeping them at arm's length. Vultures, he'd called them privately. They circle around anything that looks like it might benefit them, and they don't much care what they leave behind. The kitchen door swung open, and a young woman with dark hair pulled back in a neat ponytail entered carrying a box of glassware. She moved with the efficient grace of someone accustomed to hard work, her movements economical and precise. "Mrs. Brown, I'm Rosa Martinez from Elegant Affairs Catering. Mrs. Ashworth hired us to help with service tonight." Rosa's voice carried a slight accent and genuine warmth that felt foreign after 3 weeks of Victoria's calculated charm. Martha wiped her hands on her apron, studying the young woman's face. Rosa's eyes held a directness that reminded Martha of her former students, the ones who'd grown up fast and learned to read situations with survival instincts. "Please, call me Martha. And I appreciate the help, though I have to admit I'm not entirely sure what my role is supposed to be tonight." Rosa set down the box carefully, her expression thoughtful. "Mrs. Ashworth mentioned you'd be handling the kitchen duties while we manage the dining room service. She was very specific about wanting you to, how did she put it? Stay where you're most comfortable." The phrase hit Martha like a slap. Stay where you're most comfortable. In the kitchen, away from the guests, away from the conversations happening in her own dining room. "I see." Martha's voice remained steady, though something cold settled in her chest. "And what exactly did she tell you about tonight's arrangement?" Rosa hesitated, clearly sensing the undercurrent of tension. "She said this was your home, but that she was hosting on your behalf. That you preferred to focus on the cooking rather than entertaining." Preferred. As if Martha had chosen to be relegated to kitchen duty in her own house. The next few hours passed in a blur of preparation that felt increasingly surreal. Martha found herself taking orders from hired staff in her own kitchen, watching strangers rearrange her furniture to accommodate Victoria's vision of proper entertaining. When she'd suggested using Robert's favorite serving pieces, crystal bowls that had been wedding gifts, Victoria had firmly redirected her toward more practical options. "We can't risk anything irreplaceable, Martha. You understand." By 7 o'clock, the house hummed with the kind of energy it hadn't seen since Robert's funeral reception. But this energy felt different. Predatory rather than celebratory. Martha caught glimpses of the arriving guests through the kitchen window. Expensive cars, designer clothes, the kind of calculated elegance that Robert had always said cost more in maintenance than in purchase. "Martha, could you please make sure there's plenty of ice?" Victoria swept into the kitchen wearing a black cocktail dress that probably cost more than Martha's monthly grocery budget. "And do try to keep the noise down back here. Sound carries, you know." Keep the noise down. In her own kitchen. Martha nodded silently, watching as Victoria surveyed the room with the critical eye of someone ensuring everything met her standards. When had this become Victoria's event to manage, and Martha's responsibility to enable? Rosa appeared at Martha's elbow as Victoria glided back toward her guests. Would you like me to prepare a plate for you? You could eat in the breakfast nook while we serve. The kindness in Rosa's voice almost broke something inside Martha's chest. A plate prepared for her. In the breakfast nook. While strangers served dinner in her own dining room to people she didn't know, celebrating a cause she hadn't agreed to support. Thank you, but I'm not very hungry. Martha's voice sounded strange to her own ears, small and distant, like it was coming from someone else entirely. Through the swinging doors that led to the dining room, Martha could hear the conversation growing louder, as wine loosened tongues and inhibitions. She caught fragments. Discussions of property values, investment opportunities, the challenges of maintaining historic homes in rural areas. Of course, the upkeep on these old places is astronomical. A woman's voice drifted back. I imagine whoever inherits them often finds themselves house poor rather than house rich. Exactly why so many of these estates end up being sold, a man replied. The heirs simply can't afford to maintain what their parents left behind. Martha's hands stilled on the serving spoon she'd been washing. Were they talking about her house? About her situation? It's really quite sad. Victoria's voice rose above the others, carrying that particular tone of false sympathy Martha was beginning to recognize. Some people become so attached to their memories that they can't see practical solutions staring them in the face. Rosa touched Martha's arm gently. Are you all right, Mrs. Brown? Martha realized she'd been gripping the edge of the sink hard enough to make her knuckles white. I'm fine, just tired. But she wasn't fine. Standing in her own kitchen, listening to strangers discuss her life and her choices while being served food she'd prepared, Martha felt something she hadn't experienced since childhood. The humiliation of being invisible in a room full of people who should have seen her. The evening stretched on with the relentless quality of a nightmare. Martha cleaned dishes while laughter echoed from the dining room. She refilled serving platters while toasts were made to Marcus's political future. She wiped down counters while plans were discussed for future gatherings that seemed to assume her continued compliance and cooperation. By 11 o'clock, the last guest had departed, leaving behind empty wine bottles, lipstick-stained glasses, and the kind of casual destruction that came from people who knew someone else would clean up their mess. Martha stood in her dining room, surveying the damage to furniture Robert's grandfather had built, to rugs her mother-in-law had collected, to a space that had hosted 3 generations of genuine family gatherings. Victoria appeared in the doorway, looking satisfied and energized despite the late hour. What a wonderful success! Everyone was so impressed with the venue. You should be proud, Martha. Proud of being treated like hired help in her own home. The rental fee, Martha said quietly. You mentioned $200. Victoria's smile flickered momentarily. Oh yes, of course. Though with the additional expenses, the caterers, the upgraded menu, the extra cleaning, I think we'll need to adjust that figure somewhat. Shall we say 100? After all, this was as much for your benefit as ours. All those lovely connections you made. Connections. Martha had spoken to exactly 3 guests all evening, and 2 of those conversations had been requests for more wine. I'll write you a check next week, Victoria continued, already moving toward the door. Marcus and I are thinking the 3rd Saturday of next month for our next gathering. A literary salon, perhaps. You'd enjoy that, wouldn't you? Right up your alley. She was gone before Martha could respond, leaving behind only the scent of expensive perfume and the echo of assumptions that felt like prison bars clicking into place. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Martha stood alone in her devastated dining room, surrounded by the detritus of other people's ambitions, and finally understood what Robert had meant about vultures. They didn't just circle around opportunities. They convinced their prey to invite them in for dinner. The grandfather clock chimed midnight, and Martha Brown realized she'd just spent an entire evening being invisible in her own home. The question that would keep her awake for the rest of the night was simple and terrifying. When exactly had she agreed to disappear? The grandfather clock chimed midnight, and Martha Brown realized she'd just spent an entire evening being invisible in her own home. The question that would keep her awake for the rest of the night was simple and terrifying. When exactly had she agreed to disappear? 2 weeks later, Martha found herself once again elbow-deep in preparation for what Victoria had termed an intimate wine tasting for cultural enthusiasts. The intimate gathering had grown to 35 confirmed guests, and the cultural enthusiasm seemed focused primarily on the monetary value of the art collection Robert had spent decades assembling. Martha was arranging cheese on her grandmother's silver serving platters when Rosa Martinez appeared at her side, carrying a tray of crystal wine glasses that caught the afternoon light streaming through the kitchen windows. "Mrs. Brown, Martha," Rosa corrected herself quietly, "may I ask you something?" Martha looked up from the goat cheese she'd been carefully portioning. Over the past 2 events, she'd come to appreciate Rosa's presence. The young woman worked with quiet efficiency and treated Martha with a respect that felt foreign after weeks of Victoria's patronizing management. "Of course, dear." Rosa glanced toward the dining room where Victoria's voice could be heard directing the placement of rented furniture, then moved closer to Martha, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "This is your house, isn't it? I mean, really your house, not Mrs. Ashworth's." The question was so direct, so cutting to the heart of what Martha had been questioning herself, that she felt her breath catch. "Yes, it's been in my family for 3 generations." "Then why?" Rosa's dark eyes searched Martha's face with the kind of careful observation that came from a lifetime of reading situations for survival. "Why are you in the kitchen while she's out there acting like she owns the place?" Martha's hands stilled on the cheese knife. Hearing the question voiced aloud by someone else made the entire arrangement sound as absurd as it felt. "It's complicated. Family arrangements often are." Rosa's expression shifted, and Martha recognized something familiar in the young woman's eyes. The careful mask someone wore when they'd experienced their own share of exploitation but knew better than to say too much. "My mother used to clean houses for wealthy families in Mexico," Rosa said quietly, continuing to arrange glasses with practiced efficiency. "She always said the worst employers were the ones who convinced you their exploitation was kindness, who made you grateful for being used." The words hit Martha like a physical blow, not because they were cruel but because they were true. How many times had Victoria framed her demands as favors? How often had Martha found herself thanking her sister-in-law for the privilege of being ignored in her own home? "She also said," Rosa continued, her voice growing stronger, "that dignity isn't something someone can take from you. It's only something you can give away." Before Martha could respond, the kitchen door swung open with enough force to rattle the china cabinet. Victoria swept in wearing an expression of barely contained irritation, her perfectly manicured fingers already reaching for her phone. "Martha, we have a situation. Mrs. Beaumont from next door just called, and she's absolutely insistent about speaking with you immediately. Something about noise ordinances and proper permits." Victoria's tone suggested this was somehow Martha's fault. "Could you please handle this? I have real concerns to manage." Real concerns? As opposed to Martha's imaginary ones, apparently. "I'll speak with her," Martha said, untying her apron with hands that trembled slightly. Whether from anger or anxiety, she couldn't tell. Mrs. Cordelia Beaumont had been the Brown family's neighbor for over 40 years, though Martha realized with a start that she hadn't spoken to the older woman since Robert's funeral. Cordelia had inherited the sprawling Beaumont estate from her late husband's family, old Alabama money that predated the Civil War and carried the kind of social weight that even Victoria's pretensions couldn't match. Martha found Cordelia waiting on the front porch, her silver hair perfectly coiffed despite the afternoon humidity, her pale blue eyes sharp with intelligence, and something that might have been righteous indignation. At 78, Cordelia Beaumont remained formidable in the way that only women born to genuine authority could be. "Martha, dear." Cordelia's voice carried the cultured drawl of old Southern aristocracy. but there was steel underneath the honey. "I hope you don't mind my dropping by, but I felt we needed to have a conversation." "Of course, Mrs. Beaumont. Please, come in." "Oh, I think the porch will do just fine." Cordelia's gaze swept toward the front door where the sounds of Victoria's increasingly shrill instructions could be heard. "Unless you'd prefer your sister-in-law to join our discussion?" Something in Cordelia's tone suggested this would not be preferable to anyone involved. They settled into the white wicker chairs that overlooked the sprawling front lawn, the same chairs where Martha used to sit with Robert during summer evenings, watching fireflies dance between the ancient oak trees. The familiar comfort of the space made the strangeness of her current situation even more pronounced. "I've been watching the parade of vehicles coming and going from your home," Cordelia began without preamble. "Quite the social calendar you've developed." Martha felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Victoria has been kind enough to help me with some entertaining. Since Robert's passing, the house has felt so empty." "Kind?" Cordelia repeated the word as if tasting something unpleasant. "Is that what we're calling it?" The directness of the question caught Martha off guard. In her world of polite Southern conversation, such bluntness was rare enough to be shocking. "I beg your pardon?" Cordelia's pale eyes fixed on Martha with the intensity of a hawk spotting prey. "My dear, I've lived in this community for nearly 8 decades. I've seen social climbing, I've seen exploitation, and I've seen family members take advantage of grief in ways that would make the devil himself blush." She paused, letting her words settle. "What I've been witnessing at your home falls into at least 2 of those categories." Martha felt something loosen in her chest, a knot of tension she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. Someone else had noticed. Someone else found the situation as wrong as it felt. "I don't understand what you mean," she said weakly, though they both knew she understood perfectly. "Don't you?" Cordelia's voice gentled slightly, but lost none of its authority. "When was the last time you sat in your own dining room during one of these gatherings? When did you last choose the guest list, or the menu, or even the date?" Quote. Each question landed like a small revelation. Martha tried to remember the last time she'd made a decision about events in her own home, and came up empty. "Victoria is very organized. She has connections I don't." "Victoria Ashworth," Cordelia interrupted, "is a social climber who married a small-town judge and thinks that gives her the right to play grande dame with other people's property. Her tone could have frosted glass in July. And she's been using your grief and your isolation to turn you into unpaid help in your own home." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Martha felt tears prick at her eyes, not from sadness, but from the relief of having someone else name what she'd been feeling but couldn't articulate. "Robert always said you were the smartest woman he knew," Cordelia continued. "He also said you were too kind for your own good. I suspect he never imagined those 2 qualities would be used against you by his own family." A memory surfaced unbidden. Robert, just weeks before his death, expressing concern about Victoria's sudden interest in their social life. "That woman's got an agenda, Martha. She always has. Just promise me you won't let her push you around if something happens to me." She'd dismissed his concerns as the paranoia of illness. Now she wondered if Robert had seen this coming with the clarity that approaching death sometimes brought. "What would you do?" Martha asked quietly. "If you were in my situation?" Cordelia's smile was sharp enough to cut crystal. "My dear, I wouldn't have let it start. But since it has..." She paused, studying Martha's face with calculation. "I'd remind myself that this is my home, my property, and my choice who I invite into it. And then I'd make some changes that would clarify those facts for everyone involved." From inside the house came the sound of Victoria's laughter, bright and artificial, followed by male voices Martha didn't recognize. Her own home had become a stage for other people's ambitions, and she'd been relegated to working backstage. "The question is," Cordelia said, rising from her chair with the grace of someone born to command attention, "whether you're ready to reclaim your own life or if you're content to keep playing servant in the house your husband left for you to enjoy." She paused at the porch steps, turning back with an expression that was both kind and implacable. "Your Robert was a good man, Martha. He deserved better than having his memory used to manipulate his widow. And so do you." As Cordelia's silver sedan disappeared down the tree-lined drive, Martha remained in her chair, watching the afternoon shadows stretch across the lawn. For the first time in months, she felt something besides grief and confusion stirring in her chest. It felt dangerously like anger, and underneath that anger, growing stronger with each breath, was something even more powerful. The determination to remember who she used to be before grief had made her forget her own worth. Inside the house, Victoria's voice called out with its familiar tone of expectation. "Martha, we need more ice!" Martha Brown stood up slowly, smoothed her skirt, and walked toward her own front door. But for the first time in months, she didn't hurry to fulfill someone else's demand. She had some thinking to do, and some decisions to make. The grandfather clock chimed 4 o'clock, and Martha realized that for the first time since Robert's death, she was looking forward to tomorrow. The grandfather clock chimed 4 o'clock, and Martha realized that for the first time since Robert's death, she was looking forward to tomorrow. That tomorrow came with an urgency Martha hadn't felt in months. She waited until Victoria's silver Mercedes disappeared down the drive after the wine-tasting cleanup, an event Martha had notably refused to help expedite, before making her way to Robert's study with a purpose that felt both foreign and familiar. The manila folder Victoria had brought that first day sat exactly where Martha had left it, buried beneath a stack of sympathy cards she'd never found the energy to answer. Now, with Cordelia's words echoing in her mind, and Rosa's observations about dignity fresh in her memory, Martha approached the documents with the analytical skills that had once made her one of the county's most respected teachers. What she found made her blood run cold. The simple rental agreement was anything but simple. Buried in the dense legal language were clauses that made Martha's stomach clench with recognition. Phrases about property management authority and exclusive event coordination rights, and something called beneficial use arrangements that seemed to grant Victoria far more control than any rental agreement should allow. But it was the appendix that made Martha's hands shake. Referenced, but not included in her copy, were something called supporting documentation and, quote, collateral arrangements that would ensure proper maintenance and financial stability of the subject property. Supporting documentation she'd never seen. Collateral arrangements she'd never agreed to. Martha reached for the phone with fingers that trembled between anger and fear, then stopped. Victoria would have explanations. Smooth, reasonable-sounding explanations that would make Martha feel foolish for questioning anything. What she needed were facts, not Victoria's interpretation of those facts. The Pike County Courthouse sat on the town square like a monument to Southern justice, its red brick facade and white columns unchanged since Martha's childhood. She'd driven past it thousands of times, but never had occasion to venture inside the records office, until now. The clerk behind the counter looked young enough to be one of Martha's former students, though her nameplate read Jennifer Walsh, and Martha didn't recognize the face. Jennifer's expression shifted from bored efficiency to genuine concern, as Martha explained what she needed. "Property records for the Brown estate on Magnolia Drive? Sure, I can pull those for you, Mrs. Brown. Though I have to ask." Jennifer's voice dropped to a whisper. "Is everything all right? We've had some unusual activity on that file recently." Unusual activity. The phrase sent ice through Martha's veins. What kind of unusual activity? Jennifer glanced around the small office, confirming they were alone before leaning across the counter. "Well, Judge Ashworth has been in here several times over the past 2 months, pulling records and filing new documents. Nothing illegal, you understand. He has every right as an interested party in family property matters." But what? "Mrs. Brown, I probably shouldn't be telling you this, but my grandmother always said family should look out for family, and Judge Ashworth isn't exactly known for his charitable nature." Jennifer's young face creased with worry. "There have been some liens filed against your property, and something called a preliminary financial competency assessment." The words hit Martha like physical blows. Liens, financial competency assessment. The technical language of someone being declared unable to manage their own affairs. "Can you show me these documents?" Jennifer nodded, disappearing into the back office and returning with a thick folder that seemed to contain Martha's entire financial life laid bare for official scrutiny. As she spread the papers across the counter, Martha felt the last of her naive trust crumble into dust. The liens were substantial, supposedly for event management services and property maintenance advances, that totaled nearly $15,000. Services Martha had never authorized, advances she'd never received. Each document bore Marcus Ashworth's official seal and Victoria's flowing signature as authorized representative. But it was the competency assessment that made Martha's vision blur with rage. A detailed evaluation of her diminished capacity following spousal bereavement and her inability to make sound financial decisions, complete with observations about her increasing social isolation and concerning judgment regarding property management. The signature at the bottom belonged to Dr. Harrison Mitchell, a psychiatrist Martha had never met, never spoken to, never even heard of. "How is this possible?" Martha's voice came out as barely a whisper. Jennifer's expression was grim. Alabama law allows family members to petition for competency evaluations if they have concerns about an elderly relative's ability to manage their affairs. Usually it's meant to protect people from exploitation, but she gestured helplessly at the documents. Sometimes the system gets used for other purposes. Martha stared at the papers that painted her as a confused, incompetent old woman incapable of managing her own life. Every kindness Victoria had shown, every helpful suggestion, every time she'd taken control of a decision, it had all been building toward this moment, the systematic construction of a legal case for Martha's incompetence. "There's more," Jennifer said reluctantly, pulling out another set of documents. "Power of attorney papers, filed last week. They're not active yet. They require your signature and a notary, but they're prepared and ready." Martha's hands shook as she read the papers that would sign away her legal autonomy to Victoria and Marcus Ashworth. Her property, her finances, her very right to make decisions about her own life, all waiting for a signature she'd apparently already agreed to provide. The drive home passed in a blur of fury and fear. Martha's mind raced between disbelief and the terrible clarity of understanding how completely she'd been manipulated. Every contract she'd signed without reading carefully, every decision she'd allowed Victoria to make, every time she'd felt grateful for someone else taking control, it had all been part of a carefully orchestrated plan to steal her life from the inside out. She found Victoria waiting in the kitchen, already preparing for what she described as, quote, a small strategy session for Marcus's upcoming election campaign. The sight of her sister-in-law moving through Martha's home with proprietary confidence now felt like watching a thief case the joint. "Martha, perfect timing. I was just reviewing the catering estimates for next week's fundraiser. The numbers are a bit higher than expected, but I'm sure we can work something out with the fees." Victoria's smile was bright and practiced, but Martha could see calculation behind it now, the assessment of how much she could push before resistance emerged. "Victoria, we need to talk." Something in Martha's tone made Victoria's smile falter slightly. "Of course, dear. Is everything all right? You look a bit peaked." "I've been to the courthouse." The words fell into the kitchen like stones into still water, creating ripples that spread across Victoria's carefully composed features. For just a moment, her mask slipped entirely, revealing something cold and predatory underneath. "The courthouse?" Victoria's voice remained light, but there was an edge now. "Whatever for?" "To review the property records, to see what documents have been filed in my name, to understand what I've actually agreed to." Victoria's laugh sounded like breaking glass. "Oh, Martha, you poor thing. All that legal terminology can be so confusing, especially when you're still grieving. That's exactly why Marcus and I have been trying to help you navigate these complicated matters." "Complicated matters like declaring me mentally incompetent?" The question hung in the air between them, and Martha watched Victoria's face cycle through surprise, calculation, and finally, a kind of cold resignation. "Martha," Victoria's voice took on the tone one might use with a confused child, "you've been through a tremendous trauma. Robert's death, the financial pressures, the isolation. It's affected your judgment more than you realize. We're your family. We're trying to protect you from making decisions you'll regret. Decisions like keeping control of my own property? Decisions like mortgaging everything Robert worked for to pay bills you can't afford. Like trusting strangers with your finances. Like letting this beautiful home fall into disrepair because you're too proud to accept help. Victoria's voice grew stronger, more assured, as if she were making a closing argument in court. The competency evaluation is for your own protection, Martha. And ours. We can't stand by and watch you destroy everything. The casual cruelty of it, framing theft as protection, manipulation as love, made Martha's vision narrow with rage. But underneath the anger was something stronger. The cold, clear fury of a woman who'd finally seen the trap and was ready to fight her way out. "Get out of my house!" Victoria blinked, clearly not expecting such direct resistance. "Martha, you're being unreasonable. You're proving my point about your judgment. Get out of my house. Now. And take your rental agreement, and your power of attorney papers, and your fraudulent liens with you." For the first time since Martha had known her, Victoria looked genuinely off balance. "You can't just... This isn't how... Martha, you need us. You can't manage this alone. Watch me." The two words carried 45 years of marriage to a man who'd taught her to stand up for herself, 30 years of managing a classroom full of teenagers who'd tested her authority daily, and 7 decades of Southern womanhood that included knowing exactly when to stop being polite. Victoria gathered her purse and folders with movements that had lost their practiced grace, her composure cracking like paint in summer heat. At the kitchen door, she turned back with an expression that was no longer pretending to be kind. "You're making a mistake, Martha. You'll regret this. We're your only family, and when you realize you can't handle things alone, we might not be so generous with our help." The threat was clear, but Martha felt something she hadn't experienced in months. The satisfaction of making her own choices, regardless of the consequences. "Victoria," she said quietly, "Robert always said you were a snake. I should have listened to him from the beginning." After the Mercedes disappeared down the drive, Martha stood in her kitchen, and felt the profound relief of being alone in her own home for the first time in weeks. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full of possibility. She had decisions to make, legal battles to prepare for, and allies to contact. But for the first time since Robert's death, Martha Brown felt like herself again. Not a grieving widow to be managed, but a woman with the intelligence and strength to fight for what was hers. The grandfather clock chimed 5 o'clock, and Martha realized she was no longer looking forward to tomorrow. She was looking forward to war. The grandfather clock chimed 5 o'clock, and Martha realized she was no longer looking forward to tomorrow. She was looking forward to war. But wars required strategy, and strategy required intelligence. Martha waited until darkness fell before retrieving the business card she'd kept tucked in Robert's desk drawer for 43 years. Samuel Washington, attorney at law, printed in simple black letters on cream cardstock that had yellowed with age. Sam had been Robert's roommate at Alabama, his best man at their wedding, and the closest thing to a brother either of them had ever known. He'd handled the Brown family's legal affairs with quiet competence for decades, though Martha realized with a start that she hadn't spoken to him since Robert's funeral. Victoria had insisted on handling all the complicated legal matters herself. Martha dialed Sam's home number from memory, her fingers steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to set in motion. "Sam, it's Martha Brown. I need your help." 30 minutes later, Sam Washington sat in Robert's study like a man who'd been expecting this call for months. At 68, he carried himself with the careful dignity of someone who'd spent decades navigating small-town politics without compromising his principles. His dark eyes held the same sharp intelligence that had made him Robert's favorite debate partner, and Martha's trusted advisor on everything from investment strategies to dealing with difficult school board members. "Tell me everything," Sam said simply, settling into the leather chair across from Robert's desk with the patience of someone prepared to listen all night. Martha laid out the events of the past months, with the systematic thoroughness of a teacher presenting a lesson plan. The documents, the liens, the competency evaluation, the way every kindness had been a manipulation designed to strip away her autonomy piece by piece. Sam listened without interruption, his expression growing darker with each revelation. When Martha finished, he sat in silence for several minutes, his fingers steepled as he processed the scope of the deception. "They've been busy," he said finally. "More sophisticated than I expected, but not nearly as clever as they think they are. Can they really take my house?" "Not if I have anything to say about it." Sam's voice carried the quiet authority that had made him one of Alabama's most respected attorneys. "But Martha, there's something you need to know. Something Robert made me promise to tell you only if something like this happened." Sam moved to the tall filing cabinet behind Robert's desk, withdrawing a key Martha had never seen before. From the bottom drawer, he pulled out a sealed manila envelope marked with Robert's handwriting. "For Martha, insurance against family vultures." Martha's breath caught. Even in death, Robert had been protecting her. The envelope contained documents that made Martha's eyes fill with tears of gratitude and admiration for her late husband's foresight. A detailed financial trust that protected the house and most of their assets from any claims of incompetency. Recordings of conversations with Victoria dating back 3 years, documenting her suggestions about managing Martha's affairs after Robert's death. And most damning of all, a private investigator's report detailing the Ashworths' financial troubles. Massive gambling debts, questionable campaign contributions, and a pattern of exploiting elderly relatives that stretched back to Victoria's own grandmother. "He knew," Martha whispered. "He knew Victoria would come for you the minute he was gone," Sam confirmed. "Robert started planning your protection the day Victoria suggested he should, quote, consider Martha's future security during his cancer treatment. He was furious, but he was also smart. He built you a legal fortress, Martha. The question is whether you're ready to use it." Martha stared at the evidence of her husband's love and protection, feeling strength flow through her like warm honey. Robert had known exactly what would happen, and he'd spent his final months ensuring she'd have the weapons to fight back. "There's more," Sam continued, withdrawing another folder. "The competency evaluation? Dr. Mitchell has never practiced in Alabama. He lost his license in Georgia for falsifying psychological evaluations in custody cases. The liens? They reference services never performed and use forged invoices. And the property assessments Marcus filed? They undervalue your estate by about $300,000. The scope of the fraud was breathtaking in its audacity and devastating in its implications. The Ashworths hadn't just planned to steal her property, they'd constructed an entire false reality to justify it. What do we do now?" Sam's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "Now? We let them think they're winning while we document every move they make. Keep playing the confused widow, Martha. Let them get overconfident. And when they make their final play..." He gestured to the evidence spread across Robert's desk. "We destroy them." Over the next hour, Sam outlined a strategy that was both elegant and ruthless. Martha would continue to appear compliant while secretly documenting everything. Hidden cameras, recorded conversations, financial records that would prove the systematic exploitation. They would build a case so comprehensive that the Ashworths would face not just civil liability, but criminal charges. "There's one more thing," Sam said as he prepared to leave. "Robert wanted you to know that he never doubted your strength. He just wanted to make sure you had the tools to use it." As Sam's car disappeared into the night, Martha sat in Robert's study surrounded by evidence of both betrayal and love. The documents Victoria had used to try to steal her life lay scattered across the desk. But now they looked less like chains and more like ammunition. Tomorrow, Victoria would call with plans for another event, another opportunity to humiliate Martha in her own home. And Martha would say yes, would play the part of the confused, compliant widow one more time. But now she knew exactly what she was fighting for, and exactly how she was going to win. The grandfather clock chimed midnight, and Martha Brown smiled for the first time in months. Robert had left her more than a house and a bank account. He'd left her the power to reclaim her dignity and destroy anyone who tried to take it away. War, she realized, was going to be very satisfying indeed. War, she realized, was going to be very satisfying indeed. The call came exactly as Sam had predicted. 2 days after their midnight strategy session. Victoria's voice carried its familiar blend of false warmth and barely concealed impatience as she outlined plans for what she termed our most important event yet. A charity fundraiser for the new children's wing at Pike County Hospital that would establish the Ashworths as the county's premier philanthropic family. 50 guests, Martha. Can you imagine? The mayor will be there, the hospital board, even Congressman Bradley if his schedule permits. Victoria's excitement was palpable through the phone line. This is exactly the kind of event that will cement our family's position in the community. Our family. As if Martha were a junior partner in the Ashworth social climbing enterprise rather than the owner of the venue being exploited. Of course, dear, Martha replied, her voice carrying just the right note of weary compliance. Whatever you think is best. She could practically hear Victoria's satisfaction crackling through the connection. The confused, grieving widow was still playing her part perfectly. Wonderful. I'll handle all the arrangements naturally. You just focus on the kitchen duties. Everyone raves about your catering skills. Oh, and Martha? Victoria's tone shifted slightly. Marcus will need you to sign a few more papers. Just routine event insurance forms, nothing complicated. Event insurance forms. Martha's grip tightened on the phone, but her voice remained steady. I'll be happy to review them. Review them? Victoria's laugh tinkled like breaking crystal. Oh, Martha, you know how confusing legal language can be. Marcus will explain everything when he comes by tomorrow. After hanging up, Martha sat in Robert's study, surrounded by the hidden cameras Sam had installed, tiny devices disguised as decorative objects that would capture every moment of the Ashworths' final performance. She opened her laptop, a skill Robert had insisted she master despite her protests about newfangled technology, and began typing her first report for Sam. The past week had been a masterclass in espionage, disguised as domestic compliance. Martha had documented every conversation, every demand, every casual cruelty that revealed the Ashworths' true nature. She discovered Victoria's habit of photographing valuable items in the house, for insurance purposes, she claimed, and overheard Marcus discussing property values with real estate contacts who seemed remarkably well informed about the Brown estate's particulars. Most damning of all, she'd recorded Victoria's phone conversations with potential buyers, casual discussions about the, quote, inevitable sale of the property once Martha's situation was resolved. They weren't just planning to steal her home, they were already shopping it around. A soft knock interrupted her documentation. Martha looked up to find Rosa Martinez standing in the doorway, her expression troubled. Mrs. Brown, Martha, may I speak with you? Over the past weeks, Rosa had become more than hired help. She'd evolved into something Martha hadn't expected. A genuine friend whose perspective on exploitation came from hard-won experience. Martha had begun sharing carefully selected details of her situation, and Rosa's outrage had been both validating and strategically useful. What is it, dear? Rosa entered the study and closed the door behind her, her movements carrying the careful precision of someone who'd learned to navigate dangerous situations. I overheard Mrs. Ashworth talking to her husband earlier. About you. About this fundraiser. Martha's pulse quickened. What did they say? They're planning something for that night. Something they called the final solution. Rosa's voice dropped to a whisper. Mrs. Ashworth said it would be the perfect opportunity, with all those important people there to witness your... What did she call it? Your, quote, unfortunate breakdown. The words hit Martha like ice water. A public breakdown, carefully orchestrated in front of 50 influential witnesses. It was brilliant in its cruelty. Who would question the competency evaluation of a woman who'd suffered a very public mental collapse during a charity event? There's something else, Rosa continued. I think their daughter knows what they're planning. Bethany. She's been asking me questions about you, about how they treat you. She seems conflicted. Bethany Ashworth. 24 years old, fresh out of law school, caught between family loyalty and moral conscience. Martha had noticed the young woman's discomfort during recent events. The way she avoided eye contact when her parents spoke to Martha with casual dismissiveness. What kind of questions? Whether you really agreed to all this. Whether you seem confused or incapable of making decisions. Whether... Rosa hesitated. Whether you seem like someone who needs protecting, or someone who's being protected against her will. A potential ally in the enemy camp. Martha's teacher instincts, honed by decades of reading young people's moral struggles, suggested that Bethany's conscience might be more powerful than her family programming. Rosa, Martha said carefully, would you be willing to help me with something that might be dangerous? Rosa's dark eyes flashed with determination. Mrs. Brown, I've crossed a desert and rebuilt my life in a country where people like your sister-in-law think I'm invisible. If you're finally ready to fight back, I'm with you. The next several hours passed in careful preparation. Martha called her children, conversations she'd been dreading but which proved less difficult than expected. Her daughter Sarah's fury was so intense that Martha had to talk her out of flying home immediately to, quote, deal with those vultures personally. Her sons offered legal support, financial backing, and barely contained rage at the family members who'd exploited their mother's grief. Mom, Sarah said during their second conversation, Dad always said you were the strongest person he knew. He also said you were too kind to see snakes coming until they bit you. Maybe it's time to stop being so kind. By evening, the plan had crystallized into something both elegant and devastating. Sam had prepared the legal documents that would not only protect Martha's property but expose the full scope of the Ashworths' fraud. The hidden cameras would capture their final solution in detail, and Martha had a surprise prepared that would turn their moment of triumph into their complete destruction. Mrs. Cordelia Beaumont arrived precisely at 7 o'clock, her silver hair immaculate and her pale eyes bright with anticipation. Martha had enlisted her neighbor not just as a witness but as a weapon. Cordelia's social standing and razor-sharp tongue would provide the perfect commentary for the Ashworths' downfall. My dear, Cordelia said, settling into Robert's favorite chair with the satisfaction of someone about to witness justice served with proper Southern style. I haven't been this excited about a social event in decades. Victoria Ashworth thinks she's been playing chess, but she's about to discover she's been playing with someone who invented the game. The final piece fell into place when Bethany Ashworth appeared at Martha's kitchen door an hour before the fundraiser, her young face pale with determination and something that might have been relief. Mrs. Brown, she said quietly, I need to tell you something about what my parents are planning tonight. And then, I think I need to help you stop them. Martha looked at the young woman standing in her doorway, the latest in a series of allies she'd never expected to find, and felt the last piece of her strategy click into place. Tomorrow, the Ashworths would learn that underestimating a grieving widow had been the greatest mistake of their manipulative lives. The grandfather clock chimed 8 o'clock, and Martha Brown prepared to serve the most important meal of her life. Victory, she decided, was going to taste even sweeter than revenge. The grandfather clock chimed 8 o'clock, and Martha Brown prepared to serve the most important meal of her life. Victory, she decided, was going to taste even sweeter than revenge. The morning of the fundraiser dawned with the kind of crystalline clarity that Alabama summers rarely provided. No humidity, no threatening clouds, just endless blue sky that seemed to promise perfect conditions for what Martha had privately begun calling the Last Supper. She stood in Robert's study, watching the sunrise paint the grounds of her estate in shades of gold and amber, feeling more centered than she had since the day they'd lowered her husband into the ground. On the desk before her lay the final documents Sam Washington had delivered the night before. Not just legal papers, but instruments of justice so comprehensive they would unravel the Ashworth scheme like pulling a thread from cheap fabric. Property deeds that proved Martha's absolute ownership, financial records that exposed every fraudulent claim, and most damning of all, the transcript of a conversation Marcus had never realized was being recorded. His discussion with a psychiatric facility about emergency placement options for elderly relatives experiencing cognitive decline. Emergency placement. As if Martha were a dangerous animal that needed to be caged for public safety. She folded the documents carefully and placed them in the antique silver serving tray that had belonged to Robert's grandmother, the same tray Victoria had declared too ornate for modern entertaining, and banished to storage months ago. Tonight it would serve its most important purpose in over a century. A soft knock interrupted her preparations. Bethany Ashworth stood in the doorway, but the young woman who entered bore little resemblance to the nervous girl who'd been avoiding Martha's eyes for months. This version of Bethany moved with purpose, her jaw set with determination that reminded Martha of her own students when they'd finally decided to stand up to a bully. "Mrs. Brown, I brought the documents they want you to sign." Bethany's voice carried a steadiness that hadn't been there the night before. "But first, you need to see exactly what you'd be agreeing to." She spread the papers across Robert's desk, with the precision of someone who'd spent 3 years learning to read legal language for what it actually said, rather than what it claimed to say. Martha had seen power of attorney documents before, but these were something else entirely, a complete surrender of autonomy disguised as protective assistance. "Immediate transfer of property management authority," Bethany read aloud, her finger tracing clauses that would have made a con artist blush. "Indefinite financial oversight pending psychological evaluation. Emergency medical decision-making privileges." She looked up, her young face pale with disgust. "Mrs. Brown, if you sign these, they can have you committed to a psychiatric facility within 48 hours. Permanently." The casual brutality of it took Martha's breath away. Not just theft, but imprisonment. Not just stealing her property, but stealing her very identity as a functioning human being. "There's more," Bethany continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Dad's already spoken to Willowbrook Psychiatric Hospital in Montgomery. He's told them to expect a new resident suffering from, quote, severe bereavement-induced dementia with aggressive tendencies. He's described you as violent, Mrs. Brown, dangerous to yourself and others." Violent. Dangerous. Words that would follow Martha for the rest of her life, justifying any treatment, any confinement, any abuse the Ashworths deemed necessary to maintain control of her assets. "Why are you telling me this?" Martha asked quietly. Bethany's composure cracked slightly, revealing the moral struggle that had been eating at her for months. "Because I became a lawyer to help people, not to help my parents destroy them. Because what they're doing to you is exactly what they did to my great-grandmother when I was 10 years old." Her voice broke. "I watched them convince everyone she was losing her mind. Watched them put her in a place where she died alone and forgotten, and I swore I'd never let it happen again." Family history repeating itself. Martha felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air conditioning. The Ashworths had perfected this particular form of cruelty through practice. "What do you need me to do?" Bethany asked. "Tonight, when they ask me to sign these papers, I want you to be standing where everyone can see you. And when I start reading the documents aloud, because I'm going to read every single clause in front of all 50 guests, I want you to confirm that every word is accurate." Bethany's eyes widened as she grasped the scope of what Martha was planning. "You're going to expose them publicly. In front of the mayor, the hospital board, everyone who matters in this county." "I'm going to give them exactly what they've given me," Martha said quietly. "Public humiliation. The only difference is that mine will be based on truth." The rest of the morning passed in careful preparation that felt like the calm before a hurricane. Rosa arrived early to help with food preparation, but her real purpose was to ensure the hidden cameras were positioned perfectly, and the backup recording devices Sam had provided were functioning properly. Mrs. Cordelia Beaumont made what she termed a reconnaissance visit, ostensibly to compliment Martha on her menu choices but actually to review the seating arrangements and confirm her strategic position for maximum social damage. "I do so enjoy a well-orchestrated social disaster," Cordelia murmured, her pale eyes gleaming with anticipation. "Especially when it happens to people who've forgotten that breeding is about character, not bank accounts." By noon, Victoria had arrived with her usual retinue of decorators, florists, and catering staff, transforming Martha's home into what she clearly considered her personal stage. But where once Martha had watched this invasion with helpless resentment, now she observed with the detached interest of someone watching actors rehearse a play she'd already seen the ending to. "Martha, darling, you look absolutely radiant today," Victoria gushed, her voice carrying the forced cheer of someone who believed victory was within reach. "I hope you're not too nervous about tonight. It's going to be such a special evening. Special indeed." Martha smiled serenely, the expression of a woman who'd finally learned the difference between kindness and weakness. "I'm looking forward to it more than you can imagine, Victoria." Victoria's eyes narrowed slightly at something in Martha's tone, but she was too focused on her preparations to examine the feeling closely. "Wonderful. And you have the documents Bethany brought over?" "Just a few signatures, and we can put all these tedious legal matters behind us." "I've read every word," Martha replied truthfully. "I understand exactly what I'd be agreeing to." As the afternoon wore on, Martha found herself moving through her home with the heightened awareness of someone experiencing everything for what might be the last time. If tonight went wrong, if the Ashworth's plan succeeded, she might never see these rooms as a free woman again. The thought should have terrified her, but instead it filled her with a crystalline determination that felt like Robert's presence settling around her shoulders like armor. She spent a few minutes in their old bedroom, standing before the wedding photo that had watched over their 45 years together. Robert's face smiled back at her, young and confident, and full of the love that had sustained her through every challenge life had brought them. "Watch me tonight, sweetheart," she whispered to the photograph. "Watch me remind everyone why you never worried about leaving me alone. I may have forgotten for a while, but I remember now who I am." As evening approached and the first guests began arriving, Martha made her final preparations in Robert's study. She placed the legal documents in the silver serving tray, arranging them like an elegant place setting. The recording devices were activated, the cameras were rolling, and her allies were in position. Victoria's voice drifted back from the foyer, bright with triumph as she welcomed the mayor and his wife, the hospital board members, and the constellation of local society that would witness what she believed would be Martha's final capitulation. Martha Brown smoothed her black dress, not mourning attire tonight, but battle armor, and picked up the silver tray that would serve justice with the same elegance that had characterized every meal served in this house for 3 generations. The grandfather clock chimed 7 o'clock, and Martha walked toward her dining room with the steady pace of someone who'd finally remembered that she'd never been the victim in this story. The grandfather clock chimed 7 o'clock, and Martha walked toward her dining room with the steady pace of someone who'd finally remembered that she'd never been the victim in this story. She'd always been the queen. The dining room glowed with the warm light of crystal chandeliers. 50 of Pike County's most influential citizens, seated around tables draped in ivory linen that had been Martha's grandmother's pride. Victoria had outdone herself with the staging, elegant floral arrangements, gleaming silverware, and an atmosphere of refined philanthropy that would make the evening's destruction all the more spectacular. Martha paused in the doorway, her silver serving tray balanced in hands that no longer trembled. From her position, she could see the entire battlefield, Victoria holding court at the head table, her smile brilliant with anticipated triumph, Marcus glad-handing potential voters with the confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable, Mayor Williams and the hospital board members looking appropriately impressed with the Ashworths' generosity. And there, seated at a corner table where she'd been positioned to observe without participating, sat Bethany Ashworth, her young face pale but determined, her eyes meeting Martha's with a barely perceptible nod. The moment had arrived. "Ladies and gentlemen," Victoria's voice rang out like a dinner bell, capturing the room's attention with practiced ease. "Before we begin our meal, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the gracious hostess who's made this evening possible, my dear sister-in-law Martha Brown." Polite applause scattered through the room, the kind of acknowledgement one might give to competent catering staff. Martha smiled serenely and stepped forward, the silver tray catching the chandelier light like a beacon. "Thank you, Victoria, and thank you all for joining us in my home tonight." Martha's voice carried the clear authority of 3 decades in front of classrooms, cutting through the ambient conversation with effortless command. "I have something special to serve before dinner begins." She moved toward the head table where Victoria sat, her sister-in-law's expression shifting from confidence to confusion, as Martha approached with what appeared to be documents rather than appetizers. "I've prepared a very special presentation for this evening," Martha continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "A reading of some rather interesting legal documents that I think you'll all find illuminating." Victoria's face went white. "Martha dear, perhaps we should—" "Perhaps we should let Mrs. Brown continue," interrupted a familiar voice from the back of the room. Sam Washington stepped through the dining room entrance, with the quiet authority of a man who'd been practicing law longer than some of the guests had been alive. Behind him came two uniformed deputies from the Pike County Sheriff's Department. The room fell silent with the kind of electric tension that preceded either disaster or revelation. Martha placed the silver tray on the table before Victoria and began removing documents with the ceremonial precision of someone serving a formal meal. Tonight's first course consists of fraudulent lien documents, filed without my knowledge or consent. Notice the forged signatures and the claims for services never performed. She held up the first set of papers, her teacher's voice carrying clearly to every corner of the room. These documents claim I owe $15,000 for event management services provided by my dear sister-in-law. Services that somehow included charging me for the privilege of being treated as hired help in my own home. Gasps rippled through the audience. Mayor Williams leaned forward, his political instincts recognizing scandal in progress. The hospital board members exchanged worried glances, suddenly concerned about their association with what was clearly becoming a very public family dispute. The second course, Martha continued, lifting another set of documents, features a psychological evaluation declaring me mentally incompetent. An evaluation performed by Dr. Harrison Mitchell, who lost his medical license in Georgia for falsifying exactly these types of assessments. Victoria tried to stand, but Marcus's hand on her arm kept her seated. His judicial composure was cracking like ice in summer heat, beads of sweat forming despite the air conditioning. "Mrs. Brown," Marcus said, his voice carrying the authoritative tone that had intimidated courtrooms for 20 years. "This is hardly the appropriate venue for what, Judge Ashworth?" Martha's interruption was delivered with surgical precision. "For exposing fraud? For revealing corruption? Or simply for speaking the truth in my own dining room?" She lifted the final set of documents, holding them high enough for the entire room to see. "And for our main course this evening, I present power of attorney papers that would have granted these two individuals complete control over my property, my finances, and my very freedom. Papers that would have allowed them to have me committed to a psychiatric facility within 48 hours of signing." The room erupted in shocked murmurs. Mrs. Cordelia Beaumont's voice cut through the chaos like a blade through silk. "How absolutely fascinating! Tell me, Judge Ashworth, is this the same facility where Victoria's grandmother spent her final years? The one where she died alone and forgotten after signing remarkably similar documents?" Bethany Ashworth stood slowly, her voice shaking but clear. "Everything Mrs. Brown has said is accurate. I helped prepare these documents, and I can confirm that my parents plan to have her declared incompetent and institutionalized immediately after tonight's event." The words fell into the dining room like grenades. Victoria's careful composure shattered completely, her voice rising to a shriek that destroyed any pretense of dignity. "You ungrateful little... After everything we've done for you, after we saved you from your own poor judgment, saved me." Martha's voice cut through Victoria's hysteria with the calm authority of someone who'd finally reclaimed her power. "You mean saved me from the burden of owning my own property? From the inconvenience of making my own decisions? From the terrible responsibility of living my own life?" Sam Washington stepped forward, his presence commanding immediate attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you've witnessed tonight is attempted elder fraud on a scale that would be impressive if it weren't so devastating to its intended victim. The Pike County District Attorney's Office will be reviewing all of these documents for potential criminal charges." Marcus Ashworth finally found his voice, though it cracked with the strain of watching his career implode in real time. "This is all a misunderstanding. Our concern for Martha's welfare—" "Your concern," Martha interrupted, "extended to having me declared violent and dangerous, to describing me as a threat to myself and others who needed immediate psychiatric intervention." She turned to address the room, her voice carrying the moral authority of someone who'd been tested and emerged stronger. "They planned to steal not just my property, but my very identity as a competent human being." The silence that followed was broken by the sound of chairs scraping as several guests began to leave, their discomfort with the situation finally overriding their curiosity about its resolution. Others remained transfixed, witnessing the kind of social catastrophe that would be discussed in whispers for decades. Rosa Martinez appeared at Martha's side, carrying another silver tray, this one laden with actual eviction notices bearing official court seals. "And for dessert," Martha announced with satisfaction that was almost musical, "I present legal documents requiring Victoria and Marcus Ashworth to vacate these premises immediately and permanently. They are no longer welcome in my home, at my table, or in my life." The eviction notices landed before the Ashworths with the finality of guillotine blades. Victoria stared at the papers as if they were written in a foreign language, while Marcus's face cycled through disbelief, rage, and finally the gray pallor of a man watching everything he'd worked for crumble to dust. "You can't do this," Victoria whispered, her voice stripped of all authority. "We're family." Martha's smile was gentle but implacable. "Family protects each other, Victoria. What you are is predators who happen to share a name with the man I loved." As the deputies moved forward to escort the Ashworths from the premises, Martha stood in her dining room, surrounded by the wreckage of what was supposed to have been her destruction. The remaining guests watched in stunned silence as the two people who'd entered the evening believing themselves masters of manipulation were led away like common criminals. Mrs. Cordelia Beaumont began to applaud, the sound echoing through the room like thunder. Others joined her until the dining room filled with the kind of ovation usually reserved for standing ovations at the opera. Martha Brown curtsied gracefully, her black dress swirling around her like the robes of justice personified. She had served the most important meal of her life, and every course had been perfect. The grandfather clock chimed 9 o'clock, and Martha realized that for the first time in months she was looking forward to cleaning up. After all, it was her house, her dining room, and her victory to savor. Tomorrow she would begin the rest of her life. Tonight she would simply enjoy the taste of justice, served ice-cold on her grandmother's finest silver. Tomorrow she would begin the rest of her life. Tonight she would simply enjoy the taste of justice, served ice-cold on her grandmother's finest silver. The aftermath of what local newspapers would eventually term the Magnolia Manor incident unfolded with the relentless precision of dominoes falling in a carefully constructed pattern. Martha stood in Robert's study 3 weeks later, reading the morning edition of the Pike County Herald while sipping coffee from her favorite china cup, the one Victoria had declared too old-fashioned for modern entertaining. "Judge Marcus Ashworth faces federal fraud charges," the headline declared in bold letters that would have made Robert laugh with satisfaction. Below it, a smaller story detailed Victoria's arrest on charges of elder abuse, fraud, and conspiracy. The accompanying photographs showed both Ashworths in handcuffs, their faces bearing the shell-shocked expressions of people who'd never imagined consequences applied to them. The phone had been ringing steadily since dawn, reporters seeking interviews, neighbors offering congratulations, and most surprisingly, elderly residents from across the county sharing their own stories of family members who'd attempted similar schemes. Martha's public stand had apparently inspired others to speak out about their own experiences with what the authorities were now calling, quote, "a pattern of systematic elder exploitation." A soft knock interrupted her reading. Rosa Martinez entered carrying a fresh pot of coffee and wearing the kind of smile that suggested good news. "The FBI called," Rosa announced, settling into the chair across from Martha's desk with the comfortable familiarity of someone who'd become genuine family. "Agent Harrison wants to know if you're available for a video conference this afternoon. Apparently your case has opened up similar investigations in 3 other states." 3 other states. Martha felt a mixture of satisfaction and sorrow at the scope of what the Ashworths had been doing. How many other widows had they targeted? How many other families had they destroyed with their careful manipulation and legal theft? "Tell Agent Harrison I'll be available," Martha replied. "And Rosa, thank you for everything." Rosa's eyes filled with tears that she quickly brushed away. "You gave me my dignity back, Mrs. Brown. You showed me what it looks like when someone fights for what's right instead of just accepting what's wrong." The broader impact of Martha's victory had rippled through Pike County's social structure, like stones thrown into still water. Mayor Williams had quietly distanced himself from the Ashworths, canceling several planned events and suddenly discovering pressing city business whenever their names came up. The hospital board had voted unanimously to establish new ethics guidelines for charitable events, with particular attention to protecting vulnerable donors from exploitation. Most satisfying of all, the Pike County Bar Association had opened a formal investigation into Marcus's judicial conduct, with particular focus on his pattern of favorable rulings for wealthy defendants and his use of judicial resources for personal gain. The preliminary findings suggested his corruption extended far beyond elder abuse into areas that would likely result in federal charges and the permanent loss of his judicial position. But it was the personal transformations that meant the most to Martha. Bethany Ashworth had moved out of her parents' home the day after the fundraiser, taking a position with Sam Washington's firm, specializing in elder law advocacy. Her first case involved representing Martha in civil proceedings against her parents, a symmetry that felt like poetic justice. The financial recovery looks promising, Bethany had reported during their meeting the previous week. Between the fraudulent liens, the property damage, and the emotional distress, we're looking at substantial compensation. Plus, the criminal restitution will ensure they can't profit from any of their schemes. Martha had surprised herself by feeling more satisfaction about Bethany's career redemption than about the financial recovery. The young woman had found her moral compass and was using it to help others, a victory that transcended money. The front door chimed, and Martha looked up to see Mrs. Cordelia Beaumont entering, with the regal bearing of someone who'd been invited to witness the aftermath of a perfectly executed campaign. Over the past weeks, Cordelia had become Martha's unofficial social rehabilitation coordinator, using her considerable influence to ensure that Pike County society understood exactly who had been the victim and who had been the villains in the recent drama. "My dear," Cordelia announced, settling into Robert's favorite chair with evident satisfaction, "I bring news from the country club. Victoria's membership has been revoked, Marcus has resigned from the board of directors, and the Ashworth name has been removed from the annual charity auction permanently." Social ostracism in small-town Alabama was often more devastating than legal consequences. The Ashworths would spend whatever remained of their lives as pariahs, their names synonymous with the kind of family betrayal that Southern society found particularly unforgivable. "There's more," Cordelia continued, her pale eyes sparkling with anticipation. "I've been approached by several other communities asking for advice on preventing similar situations. It seems our little demonstration has inspired a regional movement for elder protection advocacy." Regional movement. Martha marveled at how her personal fight for dignity had expanded into something that might protect countless others from similar exploitation. Robert would have been proud of the way she'd turned her pain into purpose. The afternoon brought Martha's children, who'd driven down from their respective states to witness their mother's transformation firsthand. Sarah arrived first, her lawyer's instincts immediately apparent, as she reviewed the legal documents with professional appreciation. "Mom, this is brilliant," Sarah said, spreading the evidence across Robert's desk like a prosecutor preparing closing arguments. "They didn't just commit fraud, they created a documented pattern of premeditation that turns this into a federal case. Dad would have been so proud." Her sons arrived together, their protective instincts clearly satisfied by the thorough destruction of the people who'd targeted their mother. But it was their obvious surprise at Martha's strength that touched her most deeply. Somewhere in their minds, she'd remained the gentle teacher and supportive wife who'd needed their father's protection. Now they were seeing the steel that had always been there, just carefully wrapped in Southern grace. "We should have seen what they were doing," her eldest son said, guilt evident in his voice. "We should have been paying more attention." "You couldn't have known," Martha replied gently. "They were very skilled at making their exploitation look like kindness. That's what made them so dangerous, and what will make their convictions so satisfying." As evening approached, Martha found herself standing in the dining room where her victory had been won, surrounded by family and friends who'd helped her reclaim her life. The room looked exactly as it had before Victoria's first invasion, but everything felt different. The space hummed with the kind of energy that came from being used for its intended purpose, bringing together people who genuinely cared about each other. Sam Washington raised his glass of Robert's best bourbon, His weathered face creased with satisfaction. "To Martha Brown," he said, his voice carrying the gravity of someone who'd witnessed true justice. "Who reminded us all that sometimes the most powerful weapon is simply refusing to be a victim." The toast echoed through the room, but Martha's thoughts drifted to Robert, whose protective love had made this victory possible. His hidden preparations had given her the tools she needed, but more importantly, his faith in her strength had helped her remember who she'd always been underneath the grief and manipulation. The grandfather clock chimed 9 o'clock, and Martha realized she was no longer marking time since Robert's death. She was marking time toward whatever came next, a future that belonged entirely to her, protected by laws she'd helped strengthen and surrounded by relationships she'd chosen rather than endured. The Ashworths would spend years dealing with legal consequences, financial ruin, and social exile. But Martha Brown would spend those same years living the life Robert had wanted for her, one filled with dignity, purpose, and the kind of quiet strength that could move mountains when properly applied. Justice, she reflected, didn't always arrive quickly. But when it came, it was absolutely worth the wait. Justice, she reflected, didn't always arrive quickly, but when it came, it was absolutely worth the wait. 8 months later, Martha Brown stood in the very dining room where she'd served justice on silver platters. But the space had been transformed once again, this time by her own choices, for her own purposes. Gone were the formal place settings and intimidating arrangements that had made the room feel like a museum. In their place, comfortable seating areas encouraged conversation, while easels displayed photographs documenting the stories of elderly residents who'd found the courage to speak out against family exploitation. Today marked the official launch of the Robert Brown Foundation for Elder Dignity, a cause that had grown from Martha's personal victory into a regional movement that was already changing lives across the Southeast. The foundation's mission statement, framed prominently on the mantelpiece, was simple but powerful: ensuring that dignity in aging is a right, not a privilege, and that families protect rather than prey upon their elders. The gathering was everything Victoria's fundraisers had pretended to be: genuine, purposeful, and focused on creating positive change rather than social climbing. Martha moved through her guests with the confident grace of someone who'd learned the difference between being hostess and being host, between serving others and being served by them. "Mrs. Brown," a voice called from near the front entrance. Martha turned to see Agent Harrison from the FBI, a woman whose initial investigation into the Ashworth case had expanded into a multi-state task force targeting elder financial abuse. "I wanted to update you on the latest developments." They stepped into Robert's study, now serving as Martha's office for foundation work. The room buzzed with purpose. Computers displaying case files, phones connecting with advocacy groups across the country, and file cabinets filled with resources for families dealing with similar situations. "The Ashworth case has become our model prosecution," Agent Harrison explained, settling into the chair that had once intimidated Martha during Victoria's manipulations. "Marcus received 8 years federal, Victoria got 6, and both are facing additional state charges in Georgia and Florida for similar schemes. More importantly, their convictions have led to the passage of the Elder Protection Act in 4 states. 4 states. Martha felt the familiar flutter of amazement at how her personal stand had grown into something that would protect thousands of vulnerable people. And the other cases? 17 families have come forward with similar stories. The pattern was always the same: identify recently widowed elderly women with valuable property, establish a relationship of trust, gradually assume control of their finances and decision-making, then move toward permanent institutionalization once the assets were secured. Agent Harrison's expression darkened. "Your case broke it wide open because you had the evidence, the allies, and most importantly, the courage to fight back publicly." After Agent Harrison left, Martha returned to the gathering, where she found Rosa Martinez deep in conversation with a group of college students who'd volunteered to help elderly residents navigate legal documents and financial decisions. Rosa had become the foundation's community outreach coordinator, her own experience with exploitation making her uniquely qualified to recognize the warning signs in others. "These students are doing amazing work," Rosa told Martha as the young volunteers dispersed to set up resource tables. "Last week alone, they helped prevent 3 different families from signing away power of attorney to questionable relatives. Prevention rather than prosecution. Martha had learned that stopping exploitation before it started was far more effective than seeking justice afterward. The Foundation's educational programs, legal clinics, and support groups were already making a difference in communities where elderly residents had previously faced such predators alone. A hand touched Martha's shoulder, and she turned to find Bethany Ashworth, now Bethany Washington, having taken her husband's name after marrying Sam's youngest associate. The transformation in the young woman was remarkable. Where once she'd carried the guilt of her family's crimes, now she radiated the confidence of someone who'd found her purpose in redemption. "The legal clinic is ready for its ribbon cutting," Bethany announced. "We have our first clients scheduled for next week. An elderly gentleman whose nephew has been managing his finances while systematically emptying his accounts." The legal clinic, housed in a converted wing of Martha's home, provided free legal services to elderly residents facing financial exploitation. It was staffed by volunteer attorneys who'd been inspired by Martha's story and funded by the substantial civil settlement the Ashworths had been forced to pay. Mrs. Cordelia Beaumont appeared at Martha's elbow with the punctuality of a Swiss timepiece, her silver hair perfectly styled and her pale eyes bright with the satisfaction of someone who'd lived to see justice thoroughly served. "My dear," Cordelia announced with evident pleasure, "Channel 7 wants to interview you for their investigative series on elder abuse. Apparently, our little demonstration has inspired similar exposés across the region." Media attention had been both blessing and burden for Martha. The story of the widow who'd turned the tables on her exploiters had captured public imagination, but Martha remained focused on substance over publicity. She agreed to interviews only when they served the Foundation's mission of education and prevention. "I'll do it," Martha decided, "but only if they include Rosa's story and highlight the warning signs families should watch for. This isn't about my revenge, it's about protecting others." As the afternoon progressed, Martha found herself moving between conversations that would have been impossible during Victoria's manufactured events. She spoke with social workers developing intervention protocols, with bank employees learning to recognize suspicious account activity, with family members seeking advice about concerning changes in their elderly relatives' financial management. The Foundation's impact extended beyond individual cases. Martha's documentation of the Ashworth scheme had become a training tool for law enforcement agencies, social services departments, and legal professionals. The methodical way she'd gathered evidence and built alliances had proven that systematic exploitation could be defeated by systematic resistance. Sarah Brown Martinez, Martha's daughter, had hyphenated her name after marrying Rosa's brother in a wedding that perfectly illustrated the chosen family that had emerged from Martha's ordeal, approached carrying a thick folder that represented months of legal work. "Mom, I have the final paperwork for the Foundation's expansion," Sarah announced, her lawyer's precision evident in the organized documents. "We're officially opening chapters in Tennessee, Georgia, and Florida. Each one will have its own legal clinic and advocacy program, modeled on what you've built here." Expansion meant Martha's personal victory was becoming a movement that would outlive her, protecting future generations of elderly residents from the kind of exploitation she'd endured. It was, she reflected, exactly the kind of legacy Robert would have wanted: practical help for people who needed it most. As evening approached, the gathering evolved from formal presentation to intimate celebration. Martha's children shared stories about their father's protective instincts and their mother's hidden strength. Sam Washington raised toasts to the power of documentation and the importance of having allies. Rosa spoke about the dignity of fighting back against injustice, regardless of the personal cost. But it was Mrs. Cordelia Beaumont who provided the evening's most poignant moment, rising with the imperial grace that had intimidated 3 generations of social climbers to offer her own perspective on Martha's transformation. "I've lived in this community for nearly 8 decades, Cordelia began, her cultured voice carrying clearly through the dining room. "I've watched families rise and fall, seen fortunes made and lost, witnessed the complete cycle of what we like to call civilization. But rarely have I seen someone face absolute betrayal and respond with such perfect grace." She paused, her pale eyes finding Martha's across the room. "Grace, you understand, is not the same as submission. True grace is knowing exactly when to stop being gracious, when protecting yourself and others requires that you fight back with everything you have. Martha Brown showed us all the difference between being a lady and being a doormat. The applause that followed was warm and sustained, but Martha felt her attention drawn to the grandfather clock that had marked time through every phase of her ordeal. 9 o'clock. The same time she'd claimed victory 8 months ago, the same time she'd learned to stop measuring her life by grief and start measuring it by purpose. After the last guests departed, Martha walked through her home, truly her home now, in ways it hadn't been even during Robert's lifetime. Every room held memories of the battles she'd fought and won, but more importantly, each space now served purposes she'd chosen. The formal parlor had become a consultation room for families seeking advice. The breakfast nook housed computers for the Foundation's research work. Even Victoria's preferred guest bedroom had been converted into a resource library for elder advocacy materials. She ended her evening in Robert's study, where his photograph watched over the desk that now served as command center for protecting other elderly residents from the kind of predators who'd nearly destroyed her life. The room hummed with the quiet satisfaction of work that mattered, relationships that had been chosen rather than endured, and a future that belonged entirely to her. Martha opened her laptop and began typing her daily journal entry, a practice she'd adopted to document not just the Foundation's work, but her own ongoing transformation from victim to advocate to leader. Today marked 8 months since I served eviction notices instead of dinner, she wrote. The Foundation is thriving, the legal clinic is expanding, and families across 4 states have the resources they need to protect their elderly members from exploitation. But perhaps most importantly, I've remembered that Robert didn't just leave me a house and a bank account. He left me the knowledge that I was strong enough to protect myself and others, even when grief made me forget my own power. She paused, listening to the familiar sounds of her home settling around her. No longer empty echoes of loneliness, but the comfortable creaks of a space being used for its intended purpose. Through the window she could see the lights of neighbors' homes, a community that now knew the difference between family protection and family exploitation, largely because one elderly widow had refused to disappear quietly. Tomorrow brings new challenges, Martha continued typing. A congressional hearing on elder protection legislation, a planning meeting for the Foundation's first annual conference, and 3 new legal cases that require our attention. But tonight I'm simply grateful for the reminder that sometimes the most important thing you can do is refuse to be a victim. The grandfather clock chimed 10 o'clock, and Martha Brown closed her laptop with the satisfaction of someone who'd not only survived her greatest challenge, but transformed it into her greatest contribution. She'd learned that true Southern grace included knowing exactly when to stop being gracious, and she'd used that knowledge to build something that would protect others long after she was gone. Robert's photograph smiled down at her from the mantelpiece, and Martha could almost hear his voice. I never doubted you'd figure it out, honey. I just wanted to make sure you had the tools when you did. She had the tools now. More importantly, she'd learned to use them not just for herself, but for anyone who needed protecting from the vultures that circled around vulnerability. It was, she reflected as she turned off the study lights, exactly the kind of legacy a life well lived should leave behind. The most powerful revenge, she'd discovered, wasn't destruction. It was transformation, turning pain into purpose, betrayal into protection, and personal victory into lasting change that would benefit generations she'd never meet. Martha Brown walked through her home one final time, checking locks and turning off lights, secure in the knowledge that she'd not only reclaimed her life, but used it to build something worthy of the love that had protected her, even in death. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to serve justice with grace. Tonight she would simply rest in the satisfaction of a battle not just won, but transformed into a war against injustice that would continue long after she was gone. The house settled into comfortable silence around her, no longer empty but full of purpose, no longer haunted by grief but energized by hope. Martha Brown had learned to serve justice as elegantly as she'd once served dinner, and both had nourished exactly the people who needed feeding most. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell. so you don't miss any upload from us. Quote dot.